right, you ready for this? We're diving deep into some seriously murky waters today. We've got a whole stack of expert opinions on what this recent U.S. election could mean for the war in Ukraine. And let me tell you, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've got everything from cautious optimism to, well, some pretty dire predictions. Not a lot of consensus among these experts, that's for sure.
Right. Like, everyone's trying to read the tea leaves, but the picture is far from clear.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with all this? I mean, the big question, obviously, is what does this all mean for Ukraine?
Well, you can't really talk about that without addressing the elephant in the room, the newly elected president.
Yeah.
His stance on Ukraine, it's been less than enthusiastic. And that's got a lot of people worried, and understandably so.
Yeah, I mean, he's openly questioned the U.S. being involved in the war at all. He even suggested he could personally broker some kind of peace deal.
Right. And some analysts are saying this could really weaken Ukraine's position, force them into concessions they wouldn't even consider otherwise.
Makes sense. I mean, if they think the U.S. might pull back support, their leverage kind of goes out the window.
Exactly. Stephen M. Walt, he's from Harvard Kennedy School. He puts it pretty bluntly. Ukraine's in a much weaker negotiating position now and might have to accept an outcome that's not in their best interest.
Oof, that's a tough pill to swallow.
It is. But then you've got other experts taking a different view, like Corey Shake from the American Enterprise Institute. She's pointing to all that talk from the president about giving Ukraine even more weapons. Arming them to the hilt is how he put it.
Right. So maybe this could actually lead to increased support.
Maybe. It's hard to say. This president, his unpredictability is a real wild card. I mean, on the one hand, he might pull back, try to strike some grand bargain that benefits him personally. But on the other hand, who knows? Maybe he doubles down, takes a hard line with Russia if he thinks it'll play to his advantage.
So we've got this real tug-of-war going on, even at the highest levels. But what about the actual, military aid? Will that keep flowing to Ukraine, or are they facing the prospect of being cut off?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Charles Kupchan from the Council on Foreign Relations, he's urging Ukraine to really focus on the diplomacy, He seems to think that continued military support under this new administration, it's just not a sure thing.
Not exactly the kind of reassurance they're probably looking for right now.
No, not really. But then you've got someone like James Carafano from the Heritage Foundation who sees things differently. He's arguing that U.S. interests and what Ukraine wants will likely converge. So to him, that suggests continued support.
Interesting. So on that view, it's not so much about, altruism, more about aligning goals.
Yeah, something like that. His thinking is that the president wants this fighting to stop, and obviously that's what the Ukrainians want too. So their interests kind of line up in that sense.
Okay, so two very different scenarios there. One where the aid dries up, leaving Ukraine super vulnerable, and another where the support continues, maybe even ramps up.
Right. But even with continued support, there are other challenges. Heather Conley, she's from the German Marshall Fund, she points out that Ukraine's resources are already stretched incredibly thin. Manpower, equipment, all of it.
So even with the best of intentions from the U.S., their ability to actually defend themselves is a major concern.
Exactly. It's not just about the U.S. stepping up. It's about whether Ukraine can even sustain this fight, no matter who's in the White House.
Okay, so we've got these questions about aid, about their own ability to hold out. But then there's the whole issue of peace negotiations, right? The president, he's repeatedly said that he can end this war quickly, broker a deal, get everyone to the table. Which, kind of sounds a bit like a sales pitch, right?
A little bit, yeah. Victoria Vidovichenko from Cambridge, she actually took a deep dive into a peace plan proposed by the president's advisors, and she's highlighting some potential pitfalls, like, for example, Ukraine having to give up territory.
So peace, maybe, but not on terms that most Ukrainians would be happy with.
Right. But she also points out that this president has surprised us before. Remember the whole thing with the Nord Stream pipeline? The sanctions. Not exactly friendly to Russia. So maybe he is willing to push back, if it actually benefits the U.S.
Okay, so there's some hope for a negotiated solution, but not necessarily one where Ukraine just caves to Russia's demands. What about NATO? Where do they fit into all this?
That's where things get even more complicated. Some experts are saying that the president's going to start putting the squeeze on European allies, pressuring them to shoulder more of the burden for supporting Ukraine.
So the U.S. takes a step back, and Europe has to pick up the slack.
That's the theory, at least. But Jamie Shea from Chatham House, he's warning that this could create some serious tension within NATO. Instead of this unified response to Russia, you could see more cracks emerge, making it even harder to coordinate support for Ukraine.
So we started with a question about Ukraine's future, and now it feels like we're pulling on a thread that unravels the whole global order. This is getting intense.
And we've only just scratched the surface. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About what's at stake, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole idea of international cooperation.
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling, to be
Yeah.
honest. Like, we're so used to this idea of a rules-based order, but what happens when those rules start to get, bent or broken?
That's a question a lot of these experts are grappling with. And it's not just about the big players, the US, Russia, NATO. Vidoichenko, she brings up a point that's really stuck with me. She argues that even if Ukraine gets all the military and financial support it needs, there is another battle being fought, a psychological one.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, she's talking about the resilience of Ukrainian society, their ability to withstand not just the physical attacks, but also the attempts to undermine their morale, their spirit. She sees that as absolutely crucial to their survival.
So even if the tanks and the money are there, if the will of the people breaks, that's it.
Exactly. And she's specifically warning about the potential for disinformation campaigns, attempts to sow discord, create despair. The kind of thing we've seen in other conflicts where the goal is to basically break a nation's spirit from within.
It's almost like a hidden war running parallel to the one we see on the news.
Right. It's a sobering thought. But it's also worth remembering that, Ukrainians have shown incredible strength and determination throughout this war. I mean, their resistance has been truly inspiring.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this internal factor, the will of the people, and then we've got the external support, the role of allies. We've talked about the U.S., NATO, but what about the rest of the world? Where do they stand?
Well, Vdovychenko emphasizes that Ukraine relies on a whole network of partners for funding, support, you name it. It's a collective effort, not solely dependent on the U.S.
Which is important to remember, right? Because even if the U.S. does scale back its aid, there's still potential for other nations to step up.
Right. That's the hope anyway. But there are no guarantees. The international community's commitment, their willingness to keep supporting Ukraine, that's definitely going to be tested in the coming months and years.
Okay, so we've got this new president, unpredictable as they come. The question of whether military aid will continue, this whole dance around peace negotiations, the role of NATO and other allies, and now this whole other layer of psychological warfare, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape right in front of us.
That's a great way to put it. And like any complex puzzle, you've got to look at it from different angles, right? You've got the political, the military, the economic, and now even the psychological dimensions of this conflict. What stands out to you as the most crucial piece of this puzzle, the thing that kind of ties it all together?
I think Vdovychenko's analysis of the current support strategy, she calls it enough not to lose, but not enough to win. That's really insightful, I think.
Break that down for me. What does she mean by that?
Basically, she's arguing that the level of support Ukraine is getting right now, it's enough to help them hold their ground, prevent a complete Russian takeover. But it's not enough to enable them to launch a decisive counteroffensive and actually take back the territory they've lost.
So it's kind of like a stalemate situation.
In a sense, yeah. And she suggests that this approach, this strategy of just enough support to avoid defeat but not enough to actually win, it might be contributing to a prolonged conflict, a war of attrition that just grinds on with no clear end in sight.
And that's where the debate about peace negotiations comes in, right?
Yeah.
If a decisive victory seems unlikely, maybe a negotiated settlement is the most realistic path forward.
Maybe. But as we discussed earlier, any settlement, it would have to be really carefully crafted. It can't be a surrender that leaves Ukraine vulnerable or, rewards Russia for their aggression.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, for sure. But here's where it gets even more complex, I think. Mark Weber from the University of Birmingham, he's got a slightly different take on how this president might approach these negotiations.
Oh, right. He argues that, while the president might be skeptical of the war, eager to reduce U.S. involvement, he's also a very shrewd deal maker. He's not going to want to be seen as being outmaneuvered by Putin.
So tough negotiator, not a pushover.
Exactly. And Weber suggests that the president might even see this as an opportunity for the U.S. to benefit, economically or strategically.
Benefit? In what way?
He mentions things like arms transfers, potentially profiting American companies by supplying weapons to Ukraine. It's a cynical view, but it kind of aligns with this president's, business-oriented mindset.
So the president wants out of this war, but he also wants to make sure the U.S. comes out on top.
Yeah, that's Weber's take. And it just adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation. We have to consider not just the geopolitical implications of the war itself, but also the potential for it to be used as leverage in a larger game of international power dynamics.
It's starting to feel like a high-stakes poker game where everyone's bluffing, trying to figure out each other's next move. And in the middle of it all is Ukraine, their fate hanging in the balance.
It's a powerful image, and it highlights the human cost of this conflict. We can't lose sight of the fact that amidst all the geopolitical analysis and strategic maneuvering, real people are suffering, real lives are being lost.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've explored the potential impact of the U.S. election, the different views on military aid, the possibilities and challenges of peace negotiations, the role of NATO and other allies, and even this psychological warfare that's being waged. It's a lot to absorb, but hopefully it gives our listener a more nuanced understanding of this incredibly complex situation.
I hope so too. Because the more we understand, the better equipped we are to, engage in these crucial conversations and advocate for solutions that actually make a difference.
So much to think about here. We've talked about shifting political landscapes, potential peace deals, the impact on global alliances, and even the psychological battle being waged in this war. What stands out to you as the biggest takeaway from all these expert opinions?
What really strikes me is how this conflict has exposed those fault lines in the global order. Like, we're seeing a realignment of power, a questioning of these long-standing alliances, and this feeling that the rules of the game are changing.
It's like we're watching the tectonic plates shift beneath our feet, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Ukraine's right there, caught in the middle of it all.
Exactly. And that brings up this question I keep coming back to. What role does the U.S. want to play in this new world? Are they going to lead the charge, step back, or try to chart some middle course?
And how does that impact Ukraine? Because they're the ones caught in the middle of this whole geopolitical tug of war.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the abstract analysis, the strategic maneuvering, but we can't forget that it's the Ukrainian people who are bearing the brunt of this conflict. Their lives, their futures are hanging in the balance.
And yet, amidst all the uncertainty and the very real danger, their resilience has been remarkable. Standing up to a global superpower like that, it's a testament to the power of unity, the strength that comes from fighting for what you believe in.
It really is. And it makes you think about the true cost of war, not just in terms of territory and resources, but in terms of human lives, dreams shattered, a whole generation shaped by this conflict.
We've explored these different scenarios, potential peace deals, the U.S. taking a step back, this liquid gold strategy. But I keep getting this feeling that the world is at a crossroads, like things are fundamentally changing.
Absolutely. And it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of global security, the way nations interact with each other, the whole balance of power in the 21st century.
So we've laid out the complexities, the potential risks and opportunities, the different perspectives from these experts. What's the message you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive? What should they be thinking about as they go back to their daily lives?
I think it boils down to this. We can't afford to be passive observers in this moment. The choices that are made, the actions that are taken, they'll have ripple effects far beyond the borders of Ukraine.
So what can our listeners do? Should they just sit back and watch this all unfold?
Not at all. Stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, challenge your own assumptions, and make your voice heard. This isn't just about Ukraine's future. It's about the kind of world we all want to live in.
Exactly. And remember, the future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the actions we take, the choices we make. So keep digging, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.